Right, I hope this one doesn't sound too repetitive, but I came across a meme earlier, and they showed a black guy, just his profile, his face. I don't know who he was, if he was a random person or a prominent figure. I honestly didn't know, but basically, it was a Black Lives Matter kind of message. And what it says, I'll just read it out. I've got it right in front of me here. It actually looks at kind of one of those modeling. The guy looks like a model, like you'd get in a fashion magazine. There's a big red line going down the middle, and it says, and there's captions on both sides. We said Black Lives Matter. Never said only Black Lives Matter. We know all lives matter. Like this is split captions. And then at the bottom, it says, we just need your help with Black Lives Matter for Black Lives are in danger. Right. So on the surface, that sounds very reasonable. It sounds like, okay, well, reaching out, that's all fine. But is that entirely honest? I don't think that it is. Let's just break this down a little bit. First point, we said Black Lives Matter. That's probably the most honest bit. That is what the movement says. That's what it's called. Black Lives Matter. Never said only Black Lives Matter. Now this gets more complex. They technically haven't said that. No, you won't find any Black Lives Matter person saying that only Black Lives Matter. The actor John Boyega and the boxer Anthony Joshua were both quick to say, "Oh, but we're not saying only Black Lives Matter," when they made their public statement at their rallies in London. But if your whole movement is based on ethno-centric statement, Black Lives Matter, then inevitably it is going to come under scrutiny because many people will interpret that as only being about Black lives. So you can say, oh no, I know that other lives matter, but Black Lives Matter right now. Okay, well, let's look at that. We know there's been high profile cases of black men being killed by the police. George Floyd, of course, Eric Garner, Breonna Taylor, who, there's been some women as well. And these cases are concerning if you look at the circumstances and the way they have died. And there's others, there's many others. Okay, I'm under no pretense about that. There are many cases of dubious circumstances where black suspects have been killed by the police, many of them unarmed. What Black Lives Matter won't tell you is that there are also many white Americans killed by the police, and some of them are unarmed. So it's irrefutable there is not the same level of outrage. That's a fact. There just isn't, okay? So the message of Black Lives Matter right now would insinuate that there's a particular problem facing black people with police brutality. That's misleading. And it's not to say that it doesn't happen. That is not what I'm saying. It's to say that if you actually look at the data, and I provided this recently from the FBI's own crime statistics, the data tells a very different story. It suggests, for example, that far more black people are killed by other black people in the United States. It says that more white people are killed by black offenders than white offenders killing black people. Um, and it says that actually in both racial groups, more white people die from white people than from black people as well. Um, but Black Lives Matter puts out this narrative that America is a terrible racist country where black people are being killed for fun. Now, that is one of my biggest issues with this movement. I think they're alarmist and they distort the truth. Let's look at some of the other points here on this meme. Um, we know all lives matter. Very good. But you're still insisting that the focus is on black lives. We just need your help. If Black Lives Matter for black lives are in danger. Well, if the issue is police brutality, which is a big central aspect of this, then one could easily argue that all Americans' lives are in danger from corrupt police. I don't think that's actually the case. I do think there is corrupt police. And I do think there are thugs who wear uniform who think that wearing a uniform gives them a green light to behave in ways that no civilian will get away with. But in that case, it's a problem for How can they say that the young guy, for example, I highlighted his case a few videos back, I believe it was Grand Rapids, Michigan, minding his own business. FBI police, excuse me, not state police, federal police, um, immediately confronted him. They took his wallet. They were plain clothed, so he didn't know that he wasn't just being mugged. They ended up beating him to the point where he was in hospital, all because of mistaken identity. Instead of apologizing, instead of paying out compensation, they've tried to charge him. It's a disgraceful case, and it's just a reminder of why the narrative that there's a specific problem against black people is flawed, because you could find many examples of white people also suffering from police brutality. Many examples. In fact, some of the high profile cases in the UK I can think of. John Charles de Menezes was a Brazilian national shot after the London bombings in controversial circumstances. Ian Tomlinson was a white man who was pushed by the police at the G20 protests in London back in 2009. Indeed, there was the elderly man pushed by the police in Buffalo, New York, recently. Many of the victims of the recent violence have been white, and some of them have been blatantly victims of racial hate crime. There was footage coming from, it was grainy, but you could tell the dialogue was obvious. They're white homies that get them. This was a gang of black thugs specifically targeting white people in that particular neighborhood. And I'm not sure what state it was, but it was troubling footage. There was another footage I saw of a white guy somewhere in New York City, um, and it looked like he was being accosted by a group of black people. There was a black woman kind of gyrating against him. It could be seen as sexual assault, actually. He didn't look comfortable. He didn't look like it was some sort of, just like it was his girlfriend or something. And he kind of like confronted this black guy that was laughing at the situation, and the guy knocked him out. They didn't try to help him, they just laughed at him. There was a white business owner who was basically beaten to a pulp for trying to protect his business in New York City, and black thugs attacked him. Now, of course, there's white rioters as well, and there's plenty of white thugs in all of this unrest. I'm not saying there isn't. But there are a lot of things that Black Lives Matter have not answered. They make all the demands. They say we're victims of racism, we demand things change. We're going to vandalize statues, we're going to put out this narrative that we're living in a terrible racist country. And then you get emotional manipulation by the likes of Al Sharpton, who says that we've had the white man's knee on our neck for 400 years. So that's very clearly, using emotive language regarding the transatlantic slave trade. He knows full well that things have improved a lot since the 60s. There's still challenges, still big problems, but I think it would be grotesque to suggest that either Britain or the United States is where it was in the past. I mean, I freely admit Britain had a serious racism problem in the past. Even BBC News reports would use language we would, totally cringe at today. At the time of the first, the Windrush generation when they came to Britain in the 50s and 60s, sort of language that was being used at that time, let's just face it, was plain racist. Um, and there was a lot of racism at the time. The Notting Hill riots of 1958. I'm actually going to watch a film about that after this, starring David Bowie. Should be good. Anyway, one of the triggers for that was the fact that a black guy and his white girlfriend were having an argument. Just an argument, their own business. But some white teddy boys decided to stick their nose into it, and then it turned into a full-on race riot. But I would actually say that in some ways it's went in the other direction. Whereas, let's say, from looking at the British situation from the 1960s, 1950s to the probably mid 80s, there very clearly was a problem of real white supremacist, racist factions. And they've always been around. But, those were the days when National Front thugs would attack Pakistani shopkeepers just for the hell of it. And that sort of mentality had support. Now, in the 2000s, the BNP had a bit of a peak when it done well in council elections. Then by the end of the decade, it had totally slumped down. The EDL in Britain first formed in response to Islamic extremism. Some would say they 30 years ago would have been the National Front. I'm inclined to agree with that. I don't particularly trust those organisations. I think they act like a bunch of football hooligans, and they might say that they're inclusive and they're not focused on race. It's not their main focus, but give a few of them a few beers, and I think you'll start to see the true colours. So no, I don't have any sort of trust in the ADL of Britain First, but I think the days when there was signs up in places like Birmingham literally saying no blacks and no Irish, it's not an exaggeration, that really did happen. That's would be absolutely it would be impossible today. Any business that done that, they wouldn't only be prosecuted for discrimination, they would probably get angry protests outside their business. Um, so that's something that Black Lives Matter is fundamentally dishonest about, where they try to imply that it's exactly the same situation as it was 40, 50 years ago. And what does that do? Helps no one. I mean, a friend of mine, Melissa Chen, wrote an interesting thing earlier. She wrote that if if the whole thing about racial pride is based on pride that you have suffered and you have martyrized and you've been victim of oppression, and that's where your whole pride is based on, i.e., black pride, then how do you ever get out of that way of thinking if that pride keeps you going? So how do you ever get into a frame of mind where you don't see yourself as a victim? I mean, a lot of what we're seeing here is I've seen, for example, every time I get a failed job interview, that's racism. And I think the danger here is reading racism into absolutely everything. Aside from the fact I had quite a robust debate with a Nigerian acquaintance, and she was trying to justify Black Lives Matter. I was pretty much making the point to making in this video. She pointed out that she'd applied for the UK to work as a nurse, and she pointed out the rate of black and minority people who've died on the front line during COVID. My response to that was the reasons need to be understood, they need to be taken seriously. I do not accept that racism must be the answer. It could be that there's a lot of factors involved in that. But I don't see how a virus can be racist. And if your position is, oh, well, it's the circumstances, like people who are poor being more impacted, there hasn't been any study on, for example, the disparity in COVID deaths between the wealthy and the poor. So we might actually find that that impacts white poor people just as much. It's just that the focus has been on the deaths of minority people, and that has been high. It's also incidentally been high from men. Why is it that far more men have died than women? That needs to be understood. So I'm not against those sort of things being looked at. And if there are racial disparities, they need to be absolutely urgently addressed. So I think, for example, there is a problem with um, probably a disproportionate number of young black men being involved in the prison system, both sides of the Atlantic. But then you need to look at, well, gang membership. Where are the crimes? Look at London, black on black homicides. This is a severe problem. But, Black Lives Matter. Okay, I actually responded to the guy who posted this. Um, yes, Black Lives Matter. So why is Black Lives Matter largely moot when it comes to black on black crime? It seems to me to be a very valid point. Now, when I raised that issue with the Nigerian woman, she said, oh, there's different movements going on. Like she tried to deflect, she tried to say, well, there is concern about that, there's other movements going on. No, I don't accept that. If Black Lives Matter, if their whole central focus is about black lives, then they have to look across the board. Surely their priority then should be black on black crime, given that it kills more black people than the police. That's a fact. It's certainly a fact in this country. So then the obvious question is why? Why do they ignore that? Or why do they they just don't spend much time focusing on it? I'm not saying every person involved in Black Lives Matter doesn't care about it. Anthony Joshua mentioned knife crime, but the focus is not on that. And just for the record, I don't believe that everyone involved in Black Lives Matter hates white people. I don't believe that every BLM activist is black supremacist who hates white people. I don't think that's the situation. I do think it is a divisive organization. I don't think it's building bridges. I don't think it's really doing much to change things. All it's doing is causing a lot of resentment, a lot of anger, and a lot of bitterness, and promoting a victimhood narrative. It's basically saying if you are black, any hardship you face in life is because you are black. If you don't get a job because you don't have enough experience, that's because you're black. It's not because you just don't have enough experience. That's why Black Lives Matter, in my opinion, is a very irresponsible organization. Also, I do not like the way that large segments of the media and politicians are pandering to this movement. Why? What have they done to deserve it? My attitude is okay, they've got these concerns, they're raising these issues, so let's listen to them. Let's talk about the issues. And where there is racial disparity, the reasons need to be seriously looked at, right? So I'm not saying let's just ignore them. I'm saying let's listen to the concerns. Look at what's happening to Dominic Raab. The Foreign Secretary pointed out that this kneeling gesture is an act of subservience, and that isn't empowering. How does that empower black people? That's what he was saying. So now the BBC and others are spinning the controversy. Like he's somehow okay with racism. This is the sort of distortion we're talking about. Keir Starmer took the knee. I don't think he should have. And now I believe the Met shouldn't have taken the knee. At the time, I had mixed views about it. I've decided no, they shouldn't have because it shows bias. And what happens when they start kneeling to one group of protesters but then arresting another? A lot of people have been quick to say the majority of protesters with Black Lives Matter were peaceful. I would say a lot of them were peaceful, but I would say it wasn't like a small little handful of people that were causing problems. There was some troubling footage. Sky News Australia um, female reporter, was accosted at one of the protests in London. She was grabbed by a man. Now she wasn't wounded, but that would have been frightening. A group of black thugs chased down a news crew down this tunnel. I think it was a BBC news crew actually. What the hell is that about? I do not see how, in any way, shape, or form, that could be. I've heard this excuse. Well, when you oppress people for so long, the rage will just boil over, and it's this argument of black rage. But I take the view that people are responsible for their own actions. And if you behave like a thug, I don't care if you're white, black, or Asian, I'm going to call you a thug. So if these black thugs who are, whether they're actual Black Lives Matter activists or they're just using it as an excuse, they are black thugs. Just as far right types who gathered a few days later were white thugs. Okay? Thug is a thug. And I do think segments of the media and segments of our political world are absolutely toning down the rhetoric when it comes to the Black Lives Matter law. Priti Patel and a few others, Boris Johnson, did condemn the thuggery that came out of the Black Lives Matter protests. But you get the impression that, I mean, look at Sadiq Khan's response. His attitude to the violence of the Black Lives Matter event was he was disappointed with it. And there were a few people causing problems. He was downplaying it, basically. When it came to the far right types who were also behaving that way, chucking bottles at the police, getting drunk, making an ass out of themselves, then it was very much about, very much the hard-lying, in control mayor, you know. These thugs must face the full consequences of the law. Why can't he use the same language for the BLM thugs? And what's so toxic about this situation is white people can't even point it out. They can't even defend themselves without charges of racism. So we're now in a situation where black people who are committing crime, whether it be looting or vandalism, and yes, I know there's white people doing that as well, but because the police are accused of racism, because the government's accused of racism, because our whole terrible society is racist, then we're basically saying that if a black criminal gets arrested for what they have done, or they're held to account for what they have done, or they're condemned for what they have done, oh, that's racist. You can't say that. I think that's grotesque. And Black Lives Matter is partly responsible for creating that atmosphere because they put out the message that if you If you criticize black people, that's racist. Apparently, black people aren't responsible for their own actions. Now, Black Lives Matter always say, "Oh, we don't condone looting, we don't condone violence," but they won't actually condemn it when it does happen. They won't unequivocally say, "We want nothing to do with this. We're angry about police injustice, but we condemn the violence." The John Boyega, the actor, when he spoke, he said, "We want to be peaceful here. We want to do this responsibly." Okay, but so yeah, there is responsible people in the movement. I don't think it's enough to just say, "Please don't be violent." I think you have to actively condemn it when it does happen. If white people, this is the point, if white people are expected to condemn white racism and acknowledge white racism, why shouldn't black people be obliged to, call out and condemn black racism when some of it blatantly is racist? And why is the outrage so selective? I mean, we hear about the transatlantic slavery. Why is there such a little attention from African Americans on the Arab slave trade, which enslaved black people for far, far longer? The transatlantic slave trade we're talking about, let's say, began in the Elizabethan period. It was outlawed in the early 19th century. So we're talking about 2.5 centuries, roughly speaking. The Arab slave trade went on far, far, far longer, and in fact still goes on. The worst slavery in the world today is in countries like Mauritania. So I do question selective outrage. I do question the selective focus on the transatlantic slave trade when there has been more honesty over that than there has over every other form of slavery. Indeed, it's been pointed out that the word slave itself comes from Slav, comes from keeping Slavic people in bondage. I mean, slavery has been a plague on humanity pretty much as long as civilization has existed. We can find it going back to ancient Egypt, and it's very much alive in the world today. Why is all the focus when it comes to slavery on the transatlantic slave trade? Doesn't make sense. I know this argument about, well, it's a legacy and it's generational, so black people not doing well today, living in poverty, and so on, that's all a legacy of slavery. Okay, well then how do you explain poor white people? They weren't slaves, they weren't transported over from Africa, so why are they still in poor conditions? I think the reasons are more complex than the simple narrative. Black people are doing badly because of 400 years of racist whites. That's not to dismiss that. It's not to dismiss the long history of institutional racism in the United States, but it doesn't answer the situation of poor white people. Just doesn't. So summed up, I'm not against Black Lives Matter as a principle. I've never been against that. I'm not even against all their contentions. For example, one of them is about police brutality. If all these protests have given more scrutiny of the police around the world, that's a good thing. The police should be held to account. But I still say that the narrative is fundamentally problematic. It is ethnocentric. Whatever way they want to gloss it over, Black lives matter, insinuate other lives don't matter. That's maybe not what they're feeling, but that's what it insinuates. Imagine any movement whatsoever that had white in its name would be seen as an ethno-nationalistic movement. It would be seen as a white supremacist movement. So I really think that this is just causing a lot more harm than good. And I think it's very problematic that so many politicians and so many segments of the media and the police and celebrities have really jumped over themselves to endorse Black Lives Matter because they feel they have to prove that they're not racist. I think that's really sad because it's not going to help anyone. It won't help black people. It will only engender this notion of it will only entrench this notion of victimhood. It won't help. It just won't. I've had disappointments in life, and yes, it sucks. I get it. But when I don't get a job that I particularly want, and there was one I particularly wanted last year, I was disappointed. I done everything they asked for. I had everything they asked for. I didn't get it. Now, I was disappointed and I was frustrated that they didn't give me any reason. But did I say, oh, it must be immigrants taking the jobs? Did I say, oh, it's black people getting preference? No. No, I didn't. I thought, okay, well, the jobs market's difficult right now. I don't have enough experience, etc., etc. I don't think Black Lives Matter is an empowering organization. How can it be empowering when the message is, and in that sense, although there's analogies, I think, with the Black Panther movement of the 60s and 70s, in a way they were about black power, this is just about victimhood. It's just about racism, you know? But let's just turn a blind eye to black racism. That's fine. Yeah, another video I saw, black guy, young black guy walking down the street, elderly white lady in a wheelchair, just pushed her over, someone in the United States. Now, was that random? Maybe. But if that was racially motivated, where's the outrage? So there is a big onus on the media and politicians not to be show double standards with this. What they need to get into their heads is any perception of double standards will only fuel the flames. And I think that's what's happened.